Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Art Deco Weekend 2022 program, Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, and the Art of Fake News. We're really honored to have Brad Schwartz here to give this talk. Brad is a doctoral candidate at Princeton University, studying 20th century American history with a special interest in questions of media and journalism, law and policing, and the cultural production of history. His undergraduate thesis at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor explored Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcasts, drawing upon an untapped trove of listener letters to challenge the standard narrative of the so-called panic broadcast. This research became the basis for his book, Broadcast Hysteria, which you can see here, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News. It was published in 2015 by Hill and Wang. In 2013, he co-wrote a documentary about War of the Worlds for the PBS series American Experience, based in part on his thesis research. And his second book, Scarface and the Untouchable, Al Capone, Elliot Ness, and the Battle for Chicago, co-written with Max Allan Collins, was published by William Morrow in 2018. So we are very excited to welcome Brad on, and also wanted to mention that anyone that's interested in the program for Art Deco Weekend can check out artdecoweekend.com for a full listing of all of the upcoming events. Brad, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here virtually, Daniel. Thank you for the great introduction. As you said, I was really looking forward to coming down, not least because I am currently in Michigan and I'm looking out at a lot of snow out my window. So being in South Florida is very appealing this time of year. But maybe next time for sure I'll be down there sooner than later, because I know I've spoken to you before about Al Capone, and there's a lot of Capone history down there. So this is actually a sort of particularly appropriate weekend to be celebrating the history of the radio and broadcasting at Art Deco Weekend, because this weekend is going to mark sort of the anniversary of a key turning point in the history of broadcasting. Nearly a century ago this Sunday, the radio audience heard something that they'd never heard before, but which all of us nearly 96 years later know all too well. So on January 16th, 1926, radio listeners heard terrifying reports of a protest in the capital of the most powerful nation on earth that quickly spiraled into mob violence, of speakers moving the crowd to sack public buildings, hang top officials, and attack the very seat of government itself. I doubt that very many of the viewers here have ever heard of this broadcast that I'm describing, unless you read my book, in which case I thank you very much. But it was a major influence on something else we're going to talk about, as Daniel alluded to, the War of the Worlds broadcast. And it represented something that was really the first warning sign of a great crisis that threatens us all in the 21st century. And it set something in motion that's still very much with us today. So come back with me now, 96 years, back to January 1926. At that time, radio was just coming out of its infancy. It wasn't quite yet a true mass medium, but the signs of its explosive growth were there. Radio stations were springing up all over the United States, but it would be another 10 months until November 1926 before the National Broadcasting Corporation debuted the first coast-to-coast radio network in America. And in many ways, I think the development of radio in this period resembled the growth of something we're all familiar with, and that's the internet and social media. Like the internet, radio seized the imaginations of a select few sort of hobbyists and tinkerers who experimented with the new technology in their garages and attics before its appeal became apparent to the general public. And in the 1920s, people recognized radio as a technological marvel, but it wasn't quite clear yet how or whether you might use this device to make a profit. Some manufacturers founded their own radio stations, broadcasting free programming as a way of convincing people to buy expensive radio sets. Some newspapers did the same thing, giving away news for free over the air as a kind of advertisement for their for the printed variety. And just like with the internet, back in the 1920s, there were conflicts over copyrights and piracy. Many broadcasters saw nothing wrong with playing copyrighted songs on the air until the music publishers began demanding royalty payments. And a growing number of newspaper publishers began to see radio as a threat, because who would buy a newspaper if they could get the same thing, same news over the air faster and for free? So in short, broadcasters in the 1920s were really making it up as they went along. The rules were in flux, nobody knew where this was headed, and people were willing to try anything, even let an elephant broadcast, sort of as you see here in 1925. And all of this experimentation established the practices and the parameters that still define our communications industry today. Over time, a handful of large corporations would come to control the most powerful broadcasting platforms, which still exist in one form or another a century later. But that process wasn't inevitable. In fact, the biggest question facing broadcasters in the 1920s, at least in the United States, was who was going to pay for all this. It was understood that the airwaves were a natural resource that belonged to the public, which should be used for the good of everyone. And because only a limited number of usable frequencies are available, the government had to step in and assign broadcasting licenses to prevent radio stations from constantly interfering with each other. In the United States, the job of figuring all that out fell to the Secretary of Commerce, an up-and-comer here named Herbert Hoover. But once Americans accepted that only a relative handful of people could have access to the microphone, they couldn't quite agree on who those people should be. Some of the first groups to really jump into broadcasting were colleges and universities, who used the new medium to expand their reach, even to offer degrees that you could earn over the air, like online schools today. Churches and religious groups also hoped to spread their messages via the radio, but such organizations didn't have the financial wherewithal of the businesses and the advertising agencies, who soon came to recognize what a powerful commercial medium this new technology could be. As radio grew in the 1920s, the question in the United States became whether this new medium could truly serve the interests of the public who owned the airwaves, while also turning a profit for the sponsors who paid for much of its programming. Secretary Hoover, who of course was a successful businessman before going into politics and government, initially hoped that American broadcasting would not be left entirely to commercial forces. It is inconceivable, he said 100 years ago in 1922, that we should allow so great a possibility for service to be drowned in advertising chatter. Across the Atlantic, of course, the United Kingdom had developed a completely different system of broadcasting, and it is there that our particular story really begins. The British Broadcasting Company, which only later became a corporation, was founded 100 years ago in 1922 as an offshoot of the Post Office, and its wonderfully Art Deco headquarters in London here, Broadcasting House, was completed a decade later. Unlike the chaotic patchwork of privately owned radio stations in the United States, the BBC began as a truly national network, broadcasting the same programming throughout the realm. And this raised an entirely different set of problems. The BBC could and did offer its facilities to people with differing ideas and political persuasions, but as part of the British government, it would only go so far. Access to the microphone would remain limited, but the limits differed from those that existed in the United States. And some people in the 1920s worried that this national broadcasting system that had developed in Great Britain would homogenize public opinion, influencing listeners to think and act alike. Because it did not have to rely on advertising, the BBC developed as a news medium more rapidly than American radio, but it had its own problems. Unlike in the US, where news commentators quickly became personalities, the BBC tried to assert its credibility by completely depersonalizing its reporting. BBC announcers were not journalists or commentators, but news readers. They were not identified by name because they were speaking for the BBC, and they did not gather the news. They merely read it without any emotion or excitement. In the early days, they were, even earlier than this, they were required to wear tuxedos, even though their listeners could not see them, because this was all very formal, serious business, and because newsreaders back then were of course, all men. And if they didn't have anything to say, they would tell you so, as happened one day in April 1930, when the entire script for the evening news broadcast consisted of one sentence: "There is no news." The BBC then filled the next 15 minutes with piano music. So this style of BBC news reading seemed a little ridiculous to a Catholic priest living in the UK here by the name of Ronald A. Knox. Father Knox was a rather colorful character and something of a Renaissance man. He was, of course, a clergyman who produced a famous translation of the Bible. He was also the author of several detective novels and a founder of the Detection Club, a famous group of mystery writers that included G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Agatha Christie. But Knox did not confine his literary talents to detective fiction. He also wrote many satirical essays, which showcased his exceedingly dry British wit. And he could be too clever for his own good. People kept missing the jokes in his satires, thinking he meant what he said when he had his tongue sort of firmly in his cheek. And that's what happened 96 years ago this Sunday, when Father Knox performed a radio satire called Broadcasting the Barricades over the BBC station in Edinburgh on the evening of January 16th, 1926. I wish I could play it for you, but it wasn't recorded. Nobody at the time recognized its importance, at least not before Knox went on the air. But he did, however, publish the script 2 years later in a book called Essays in Satire, so we know what went down. I won't perform it for you, and I won't attempt his accent, but I'll try to give you a sense of what happened. So if you tuned into BBC station 2EH in Edinburgh around 7:40 p.m. that evening, you would have heard what sounded like a professor with a speech impediment, giving a lecture on 18th century literature. Then an announcer came on with a weather report and the latest news describing a mob of unemployed people who had gathered to protest in London. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now assuming threatening dimensions, said Knox in his role as a BBC newsreader. Threatening dimensions are now being assumed by the crowd which has gathered in Trafalgar Square to voice the grievances of the unemployed. Mr. Popplebury, the secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, has been urging the crowd to sack the National Gallery. The desirability of sacking the National Gallery is being urged by Mr. Popplebury, secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues. Now, Knox's satire here isn't exactly uproariously funny. I'm reminded of something Hugh Laurie once said of English humor, that it often consists of jokes that may take you days to understand with very little payoff. And I think that's what's going on here. The joke, such as it is a parody of the BBC style of news reading, the sort of boring nature of it, the repetition and the complete unflappability of the commentator. As Knox describes the mob escalating from a protest to a riot and eventually to an attack on the British government, the newsreader remains calm and unemotional and entirely unimpressed. For instance, he introduces a well-known philanthropist who will give a lecture on housing of the poor. Then the newsreader interrupts himself and explains that the philanthropist, quote, has been intercepted by the remnants of the crowd still collected in Trafalgar Square and is being roasted alive. He will therefore be unable to deliver his lecture to you on the housing of the poor. The newsreader doesn't change his tone, even as he describes the mob advancing on the Houses of Parliament here and blowing up Big Ben with trench mortars. Fresh reports, says the newsreader, which have just come to hand, announced that the crowd has secured the person of Mr. Weatherspoon, the Minister of Traffic, who is attempting to make his escape in disguise. He has now been hanged from a lamppost in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. Soon thereafter, the newsreader interrupts himself to announce that he's made a mistake. Quote, "One moment, please. The British Broadcasting Company regrets that one item in the news has been inaccurately given. The correction now follows. It was stated in our news bulletin that the Minister of Traffic had been hanged from a lamppost in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. Subsequent and more accurate reports show that it was not a lamppost, but a tramway post which was used for this purpose. A tramway post, not a lamppost, was used by the crowd for the purpose of hanging the Minister of Traffic. The next three items in our program are unavoidably canceled. You will now be connected up with the Savoy Band again." Knox then had the BBC play some recorded music representing the band at the Savoy Hotel in London here, but only for a moment. It was soon cut off by the sound effect of a loud explosion. "Hello, everybody," the newsreader broke in. "London calling. That noise which you heard just now was the Savoy Hotel being blown up by the crowd. The more unruly members of the crowd are now approaching the British Broadcasting Company's London station with a threatening demeanor." And as the mob of rioters supposedly settled into the waiting room of the BBC's London headquarters, quote, reading copies of the Radio Times, end quote, Knox's newsreader signed off with a cheerful, "Good night, everybody. Good night." So what Knox and his BBC team had produced was, so far as I can tell, history's first fake news broadcast. There had, of course, been plenty of false reports and even outright hoaxes printed in the newspapers over the years. The most famous, perhaps, was the Great Moon Hoax of 1835 here, when the New York Sun attempted to drive up its own circulation with a series of preposterous stories describing intelligent bat-winged creatures that astronomers had supposedly observed living on the moon. But I'm not aware of anyone before Knox using this new electronic medium of mass communication to broadcast a false report, something that sounded like journalism, but wasn't. And given that the audience had never heard anything quite like this before, it probably shouldn't be surprising they didn't exactly know how to take it. As Knox ate dinner half an hour after the show, he learned that hundreds of people were calling the Savoy Hotel wanting to know if it had really been blown up. Some asked if they should cancel their upcoming reservations. No one was more surprised than Father Knox, reported the Manchester Guardian, to hear that anyone had taken him seriously. Back at the radio station, the only employee left in the studio, a sound effects technician, suddenly found himself answering calls from listeners who thought the revolution was real. Then a newspaper reporter called, asking rapid-fire questions that, the sound effects man said, displayed a certain lack of sympathy with the BBC and a natural desire to make the most of a good story. Newspaper offices had been receiving calls of their own. The Daily Mail summarized all these queries about the supposed revolution with this quote: "We have heard it on the wireless. Why, we have even heard the explosions." Seeking to calm their listeners, the BBC aired a statement that night, which was so condescending that it might have been another piece of satire. Quote, "Some listeners who apparently heard only part of Father Knox's talk at 7:40 this evening did not realize the humorous innuendos underlying his imaginary news items and have felt uneasy as to the fate of London, Big Ben, and other places mentioned in the talk. As a matter of fact, the preliminary announcement stated that the talk was a skit on broadcasting, and the whole talk was, of course, a burlesque, and we hope that any listeners who did not realize it will accept our sincere apologies for any uneasiness caused. London is safe, Big Ben is still chiming, and all is well." It's difficult to say just how many people did take Knox seriously. The BBC would receive a total of 249 angry letters protesting broadcasting the barricades, and more than 2,300 expressing support for Father Knox. That's a ratio of roughly 9-1. But although the show only frightened a fraction of its audience, we can hazard a guess as to why that portion of listeners believed it to be real. After all, the idea that an unruly mob of unemployed workers might attack government buildings, even hang cabinet ministers from tramway posts, seemed just as plausible in January 1946 as perhaps it does today. The Russian Revolution here was less than 10 years old. Many Britons expected a similar communist uprising might happen in England at any time. And in May 1926, just 4 months after Knox's broadcast, a general strike did erupt in the United Kingdom that paralyzed the nation for 9 days. In such a climate, it probably shouldn't have been surprising that some subset of Knox's listeners understood the broadcast to be about a communist uprising. For example, reported the New York Times, quote, "One impressionable sheriff in a northern county telephoned to the mayoress of Newcastle to ask what the Lord Mayor and constabulary were doing to stave off the Red Ruin," end quote. Knox never identified his rioters as Reds or Marxists, but that's apparently what some people heard. They missed or ignored the references to the national movement for abolishing theater cues, and instead gave in to their own fears. Across the pond, the New York Times used the incident to poke fun at the entire United Kingdom, while apparently letting their own imaginations run a bit wild. Quote, "Harrowed ladies in remote country districts who had never heard of Father Knox heard his wireless conversation," reported the Times, "and in great consternation barricaded themselves behind their bedroom doors. It was a good story, and the newspapers were full of it. It was thoroughly representative of this stodgy old country and the dear old ladies who have abandoned knitting needles for wireless sets," end quote. The Times, as you can see, also ran a separate editorial asserting that Americans were safe from such jesting for the simple reason that the United States, unlike the UK, did not have a national radio network. Such a thing as that could not happen in this country, asserted the Times, or at any rate, its harm would be confined to those who were listening to one of the 600 broadcasting stations which we, for our sins doubtless, are as radio fans afflicted. The situation in Great Britain is different. There, all broadcasting is done by or through a single company, and it is responsible for everything that goes out. But the American broadcasting situation, of course, would change in just a few short months when NBC made its debut that November. A competing network, the Columbia Broadcasting System, soon followed. For the first time, Americans coast to coast could tune into the same radio programming at the same time. Instead of following the BBC model, the United States would allow a small handful of private companies to control these platforms as profit-making ventures. But although Americans accepted a commercial system of advertiser-supported radio broadcasting, the airwaves were still public property. There remained the question of how those airwaves would be used to serve the American people. As late as 1934, there was a concerted effort to reserve up to a quarter of broadcast frequencies for nonprofit educational public service programming. The broadcasting industry successfully defeated that attempt, but the Communications Act of 1934, which established the Federal Communications Commission, seen here, did require that radio stations operate in, quote, the public interest, convenience, or necessity, end quote. If the FCC believed that a station had failed to meet that requirement, they could theoretically put those stations out of business. But nobody knew exactly what the public interest, convenience, or necessity meant, which left the broadcasting industry in a state of perpetual anxiety. Many broadcasters feared that the FCC would pull their licenses to operate if they didn't somehow live up to this vague requirement. And this fear of the FCC helped create what's come to be known as the golden age of radio. NBC, CBS, and their affiliated stations produced a flood of what were known as sustaining shows, programs that did not have a commercial sponsor, but which broadcasters aired at a financial loss as a public service. These could be dramatic shows, musical programs, or discussions of important public issues. Frequently, they were news programs, and the FCC's public interest requirement was crucial to the development of American broadcast journalism. Much early news programming was produced on a sustaining basis, paid for by broadcasters out of their own profits as a kind of tithe to keep the FCC happy. But radio news faced challenges that other kinds of programming did not. For one thing, the older news media, specifically the newspapers, still considered radio a threat to their business. In the first half of the 1930s, a period that's come to be known as the press-radio war, newspaper publishers fought to prevent the new medium from becoming a true competitor. They weren't able to stop radio from reporting the news entirely. Americans then as now hungered for the latest news, especially as events in Europe accelerated toward the outbreak of the Second World War. But the printed press did hinder the development of broadcast journalism before about 1938. The other major challenge broadcast journalists faced in the 1930s was at least partly self-inflicted. Radio, as we've said, was a technological marvel. We take this for granted now, I think, but the immediacy of radio, the fact that people could tune in on a speech given by the president in another city or a foreign leader on an entirely different continent, felt revolutionary back then. It shrank the world and it changed how people understood their place in it. But unless you knew that an event was going to happen at a specific place at a certain time, a scheduled speech or something like that, it was very hard for broadcasters to get live news on the air. Journalists couldn't just rush to the scene with a microphone. The technology was still much too cumbersome for that. They certainly had the technology, however, to record news events as they happened and broadcast the recording after the fact. That's what happened, for instance, when the airship Hindenburg burst into flames in May 1937. Radio announcer Herbert Morrison just happened to be on hand with a recording device. And his famous breathless account of the disaster was never broadcast live, but it did air later, giving people a sense of what the event had felt like. That was, however, a very rare exception to one of the strictest rules of network radio at that time. In the 1930s, NBC and CBS banned the use of pre-recorded content. Everything that they aired live, because they claimed that recordings were somehow dishonest, that listeners would be fooled into thinking that what they were hearing was happening right in the moment. And indeed, some listeners who heard Morrison's recording actually did believe they were hearing the Hindenburg burn in real time, live on the air. So because broadcast journalists in the mid-1930s were rarely on hand to report events as they happened, and because they weren't allowed to record those events for later broadcast, they couldn't take full advantage of radio as a news medium. The most popular quote-unquote news program of the decade, The March of Time, got around those constraints simply by faking the news. Rather than using recordings, they would reenact news of stories in a studio with actors, as you see here, impersonating everyone from Franklin Roosevelt to Adolf Hitler. And this was somehow seen as more authentic because the performances aired live, even though they were completely fictitious. Today, this seems outrageous and unethical. One historian of broadcasting, Eric Barnew, later called it wildly irresponsible and even illegal. But broadcasting was new and the rules were still being written. Broadcasters, again, were making this up as they went along. So in May of 1937, just 2 hours after the Hindenburg went down, listeners who tuned into the March of Time heard what the disaster might have sounded like long before they ever had the chance to hear Herbert Morrison's actual recording. But the cacophony of explosions and crashes broadcast by the March of Time were created by the sound effects team you see here, based on little more than their imaginations. And it's not entirely clear that radio audiences in 1937 could have told the difference because they'd gotten so used to hearing this sort of fictionalized news. Just to give you a sense of what the March of Time was like, I'm going to play you part of the episode of February 10th, 1938, not about the Hindenburg, but about another subject on which I've previously spoken to the Miami Design Preservation League.
Alcatraz Island. In the most grim and formidable of U.S. penitentiaries, one night this week, 2 guards approached the entrance to the cell block. Unlock and throw the heavy bolt. Roll back the massive steel door. Pause a moment on the threshold, then begin to walk slowly down the dimly lighted corridor towards the cell, which for 5 years has been occupied by prisoner number 85, Scarface Alphonse Capone.
Everyone's quiet except him.
Yeah, sounds cheerful enough.
I guess his troubles are over.
Number 85. Here we are.
All right, Capone. Better come along with us now.
Yeah, you better quit singing, fella. Keep the others awake.
Nice song, huh? Yeah. Come along now. Come with you?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, but wait a minute. What's the trouble? My bed. I gotta finish making my bed.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning.
I made it as good as I could, but there's always a wrinkle. I don't know.
Come on, Al. We'll send a guy down to fix your bed.
Okay. But I ought to smooth it out a little. Don't you think I ought to before I go?
20 years ago, a swart, stocky Italian boy came out of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and learned how to use a submachine gun on Chicago's South Side. Rode in an armored car, shot craps with $1,000 bills, sent floral tributes worth a fortune to the funerals of his victims. Became the hero of short stories, movies, plays. The #1 beer baron and big shot of the Prohibition era. This week, with eligibility for parole only 10 months away, into the hospital record at Alcatraz prison goes the entry,
Number 85, Alphonse Capone. Hallucinations and mental collapse.
time marches on.
So just to be clear, again, that was not Al Capone's voice. There are, so far as we know, no existing recordings of his voice. And the dialogue that you heard was entirely fictitious. It was based on press reports of Capone's mental breakdown in Alcatraz that week, as published in Time magazine. And in fact, technically, the March of Time was an advertisement for Time magazine and not really a news broadcast at all. But as with The Daily Show many decades later, Americans found it more entertaining than straight reporting, and many treated it as their regular source of news. Henry Luce here, who is the founder of Time Inc., later called this format fakery in allegiance to the truth. And in some ways, I think it resembles the so-called deep fake videos that we're seeing more and more of today. The technology has gotten infinitely more sophisticated, but it's still a question of putting words in someone's mouth, of creating the false impression that people, from world leaders to average folks, have said things that they never actually said. Now it takes computers and AI to create such an illusion. Back then, the March of Time just used the best performers and technicians in radio. Some of those actors went on to very illustrious careers, including a young man by the name of Orson Welles. In 1935, when Welles was not yet 20 years old, he got his big break into broadcasting by appearing on the March of Time. This was before Welles had made his name in the New York theater world. He was still just an unknown actor at the time. But even at a very young age, he had a remarkable voice that was perfect for radio, and it got him a job as a regular cast member on The March of Time. The show not only gave Welles the opportunity to meet and learn from the top professionals in the industry, whose work on The March of Time would directly influence some of his later productions, most notably Citizen Kane. Welles also became known as one of the best actors in broadcasting, and he began receiving so many opportunities to appear on other shows that he spent much of his time in the mid-1930s flitting from one radio studio to another. Famously, he started hiring an ambulance to cut through traffic in Manhattan because he claimed there was no law in New York that said you had to be sick to ride in an ambulance. So Welles's broadcasting career took off at a moment when the lines between fact and fiction, between news and entertainment, were becoming very blurry on American airwaves. The popularity of dramatized news shows like The March of Time drove some of this mixture of truth and fakery, but Welles appeared on other programs that blurred the line from the other side. Because just as news shows like The March of Time were starting to sound more like drama, some dramatic productions were deliberately trying to sound more like news. For example, Welles appeared in a very famous and important radio production in 1937, The Fall of the City, written by the poet Archibald MacLeish for CBS. The Fall of the City is the first verse play that was ever written for radio, and it was hailed as a real artistic breakthrough for the medium. It's essentially an allegory about fascism, the story of a nameless, faceless conqueror menacing a great city who turns out to be an empty suit of armor. Welles played the narrator. That's a role MacLeish designed as a kind of news commentator reporting on what he saw. And I'm going to play you a clip now from The Fall of the City, which aired April 11th, 1937, so you can hear how MacLeish incorporated the language of broadcast journalism into his dialogue.
We take you now to the great square of this city.
We are here on the central plaza. We are well off to the eastward edge. There's a kind of terrace over the crowd here. It is precisely 4 minutes to 12. The crowd is enormous. There might be 10,000. There might be more. The whole square is faces.
So that phrase you just heard, "we take you now to," was one of the magic lines of radio in the 1930s. Audiences were entranced by the medium's ability to transport them across continents and around the world to bring the news into their homes, which made events on the other side of the globe seem that much more frightening. Almost exactly a year after the fall of the city, when an actual fascist dictator, Adolf Hitler, conquered the very real city of Vienna, Austria, CBS again used that magic phrase, "we take you now," to carry listeners across the Atlantic to hear from an eyewitness, journalist William L. Shirer here, who had stepped into the role of Welles's news commentator, but in real life.
We take you now to London, England.
While Hitler continued, or you might say, completed his triumphal conquest of Austria today, Great Britain remained relatively calm. Here in London, there were some anti-German demonstrations this afternoon, a few clashes with the police, but nothing at all serious compared to what I saw in Vienna Friday and yesterday.
So that broadcast, which aired on March 13th, 1938, was a technological breakthrough, switching from one city to another so listeners could hear how all of Europe was reacting to Hitler's Anschluss. And it established the format of just about every news program that you still see on television today. It was also an example of how real events were becoming rapidly more dramatic than fictitious radio programs. To keep up, radio writers continued incorporating news techniques into fictional shows. As one guide to radio writing explained in 1937, "Don't overlook the fact that the radio audience responds heartily to news broadcasts. Capitalize on this desire for news whenever possible." Here's an example from another show starring Orson Welles, the popular crime melodrama The Shadow here, about a detective character who could cloud men's minds to render himself invisible. The show often used organ music to cue transitions from scene to scene, and this episode from December 1937 interrupts that familiar music with a fake news bulletin.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program of organ music to bring you a special news flash from our affiliated press service. New York, December 12, 1937. The shadow has been found.
So that episode of The Shadow uses a fake news flash purely for exposition, and it's clear from the first line of the supposed bulletin that the news is not real, that it's part of the show. But that other magic phrase that is used, we interrupt this program, would have grabbed listeners' attention in 1937 because such interruptions were becoming increasingly common on American radio as the news out of Europe grew more and more frightening. Americans came to expect that their regularly scheduled programming could be interrupted by alarming late-breaking news at any moment, like this bulletin from CBS in September 1939.
And now here's a special bulletin from the Associated Press. Paris. The French government announced today that Robert Cologne, French ambassador to Berlin, would call on Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, at noon, 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7 a.m. New York time, today to demand a reply to France's ultimatum for the withdrawal of German troops from Poland. This French action was order taken just 3 hours after Sir Neville Henderson, the British ambassador to Berlin, had informed the German government at 4 a.m. New York time that a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany as of 6 a.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time, unless Germany gave a satisfactory reply.
So same format as we heard on The Shadow, but of course the names and the news are unfortunately very real. So while Welles was establishing himself as a radio actor, he was also making his name on the New York stage with a series of famous and controversial productions, initially as part of the New Deal's Federal Theater Project. In 1937, Welles launched his own repertory company, the Mercury Theater, with a soon-to-be legendary production of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which you can see here, staged in modern dress as a commentary on fascism. Welles was not yet a household name outside of New York. Most of his radio work, even playing The Shadow, was done anonymously. But his onstage successes caught the attention of CBS, which offered him the chance to produce his own radio series, beginning in the summer of 1938. The Mercury Theater on the Air, as it came to be known, was an hour-long program in prime time. And it was another sustaining show, produced without a commercial sponsor, paid for by CBS as part of their public service responsibilities. Just imagine today if CBS gave an hour of primetime to a theater director that no one outside of New York had ever heard of and said, do whatever you want with it. That's essentially what happened to Welles. And he used this platform to push the art of radio drama in new and exciting directions. The Mercury Theater on the Air adapted classic works of literature from authors like William Shakespeare, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Charles Dickens. But for its 17th episode, which would air the night before Halloween 1938, Welles wanted to try something very different. He'd seen the effect that news bulletins had on radio audiences, and he wanted to capture that same excitement in his own work. As he explained many years later, I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening and would be broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time, rather than a mere radio play. So for this October 30th broadcast, Welles wanted to take the fake news style, as you've seen, to the next level. But the whole point of his radio series was to adapt classic works of literature, and he couldn't think of a book to which he could apply this idea. So he discussed it with his two key collaborators here, John Houseman, his producer on the left, and Paul Stewart on the right, an actor who served as associate director of the Mercury broadcasts. Both Welles and Houseman would later say that one of their inspirations was Father Knox's broadcast in the Barricades from 12 years before. Neither man could have heard the show the one and only time it aired over the BBC, but they may very well have read its script or heard of the furor it caused. Eventually, Houseman or Stewart suggested that they adapt The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, the classic novel about a Martian invasion of England at the turn of the 20th century. It's unclear who first brought the book up. Houseman later wrote that he doubted Wells had ever read it, but Wells embraced the idea, and Houseman passed his instructions on to Howard Koch, who was a young writer recently employed to script the Mercury radio show. That same week, Wells was preparing the Mercury's first stage production of the season, and that left him with precious little time to spend on this broadcast beyond suggesting the initial idea. So Koch may very well have been the first member of the Mercury to actually read The War of the Worlds, and he absolutely hated it, finding it both dated and ridiculous. After trying and failing to get Houseman to switch to another story, Koch produced a script that follows the plot of the original novel fairly closely, apart from making changes to update the story to a contemporary American setting. In Koch's first draft, the show was separated into 2 acts of roughly equal length with a station break in the middle. The first act, done in the style of a fake news broadcast like Wells wanted, described how the Martians landed near the tiny town of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and rapidly conquered the United States. The second act, which was done not as a news broadcast, but as an extended monologue, which would be read by Orson Welles, described the wanderings of a lone survivor who eventually discovers that 124-year-old, spoiler alert, earthly bacteria have killed the invaders. The Mercury performed a dress rehearsal of the script on the Thursday before the show without Wells and recorded it on wax discs for him to listen to later. That recording, unfortunately, so far as we know, does not survive. But everyone who heard it later agreed that it was an unmitigated disaster. Why? Well, science fiction in those days was largely regarded as kid stuff, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, that kind of thing. The idea that Mars might actually be inhabited by intelligent beings, which had seemed plausible when H.G. Wells wrote the original novel 40 years earlier, was no longer accepted by most scientists. None of Wells's collaborators found the Martian invasion plot at all convincing, and they feared that listeners would never take the show seriously. So they began frantically revising the script, making changes meant to enhance the realism of the broadcast without realizing just how well they might succeed. Wells believed, and Houseman and Stewart agreed, that the fake news bulletins in the first act were the most engaging part of the show, and the monologue in the second act was dreadfully boring. So the Mercury lengthened the first act and shortened the second, which left the script somewhat lopsided. Unlike in most radio dramas, the station break would come about 2/3 of the way through and not at the halfway mark. They could do this because the show did not have a commercial sponsor. Nobody was going to wait for the commercial that was supposed to come at the half hour. But apparently no one realized that listeners who tuned in late and missed the opening announcement would have to wait almost 40 minutes before a disclaimer explaining that the show was fiction. Radio audiences had come to expect that fictional programs would be interrupted on the half hour for station identification. Breaking news, on the other hand, of course, does not have to follow those rules. So people who may have believed that the broadcast was real would be even more convinced when the station break failed to come at 8:30 p.m. Meanwhile, the cast and crew banded together to do everything that they could to save the show. Many of them were people Wells had gotten to know on the March of Time, like sound effects technician Orrin Nichols, who you see here. Now they started applying that show's style of fakery and allegiance to the truth to the War of the Worlds, dressing it up with fake news techniques to make it seem more realistic. Nichols, for example, had to come up with the sounds of the Martian invasion, and legend has it that the scraping sound of the Martian spacecraft opening up was actually her unscrewing a pickle jar in a bathroom. Several of the actors were also March of Time veterans. One of them, Ray Collins, you see here, second or third from the right in the front, first from the right in the front row. But also Frank Reddick, who is a March of Time veteran who was cast as the radio reporter who witnesses the Martians' arrival in the show. Reddick had the most important role, really, in the broadcast. If audiences didn't believe his description of the alien invaders, nothing else in the show would work. To prepare, Reddick employed a method that March of Time actors used regularly, and that's finding a recording of whatever character they'd been assigned and listening to it repeatedly until they could replicate that person's voice. This time, of course, Reddick was playing a fictional character, not impersonating a real individual, so he did the next best thing. He found a copy of Herbert Morrison's coverage of the Hindenburg disaster the previous year and listened to it over and over again, studying the way Morrison's voice swells in alarm and abject horror. And I'll play you a couple clips now, first of the original Hindenburg broadcast and then War of the Worlds, so you can hear how accurately Reddick replicated those emotions.
It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's fire and it's frightening, terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks agree that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers.
Get the flames swinging in the mirror, and it looks like a magic man. Strike them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames.
He's caught by the wood with stars. There's gas heading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
So not only is it a great performance and a wonderful impression that he's doing of Herbert Morrison, but of course the language of the script is very similar. It's bursting into flames, they're turning into flame. It's a pretty close copy, just like you might hear on the March of Time. Still, even as airtime approached, the Mercury Theater remained convinced that the show was not going to be any good. One actor warned a writer for the New York Daily News that The War of the Worlds was lousy and would probably bore you to death. When Welles called the studio on Saturday evening, the night before the show, to ask how things were going, a technician told him that the program was very dull and would put his listeners to sleep. Where's the love interest, he wanted to know. When Welles finally took charge on the afternoon of Sunday, October 30th, about 6 hours before airtime, he really had his back against the wall. The stage play he was producing was shaping up to be a disaster. It would only run for 21 performances, and he had every reason to believe War of the Worlds would be an even bigger mess. So his only hope really for saving his career was pouring all his creative energies into the broadcast, and he began making some changes of his own. Perhaps the most important change that Welles made in this crucial period before airtime involved something that had been cut from Howard Koch's first draft script, and that was a speech given by the Secretary of War describing the government's efforts to combat the Martians. This material was probably cut because of objections from CBS's lawyers, who were uneasy about impersonating a cabinet official. When Welles put it back in, he reassigned it to a less inflammatory cabinet member, the Secretary of the Interior, in order to appease the network. But he drew on the March of Time style of fakery and allegiance to the truth to give the speech additional impact. To play the role, Welles cast another actor from the March of Time, Kenneth Delmar, who could do a pitch-perfect impression of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR's voice, of course, was well known to many Americans because of his fireside chats, and it was so influential that the White House had actually requested the March of Time stop impersonating the president so as not to rob his radio voice of its power. By 1938, the major broadcast networks all explicitly forbade anyone from impersonating the president on the air. But during the last-minute rehearsals on War of the Worlds, Welles apparently suggested with a wink and a nod that Delmar make his character sound presidential, and Delmar happily complied. I'll play you a clip now from the first of Roosevelt's fireside chats from 1933, where he's trying to calm and reassure the American people at a time of economic calamity.
Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friend. Your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Now, for comparison, here's Kenny Delmar as the Secretary of the Interior in War of the Worlds, addressing the nation not just in FDR's voice, but again, using very similar language as he tries to calm a frightened populace.
I wish to impress upon you, private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action. Placing our faith in God, we must continue the performance of our duties, each and every one of us, so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth.
So there's really no reason to believe that Welles did this with any intention of misleading listeners. All the best evidence suggests he was merely trying to capture what an actual crisis news broadcast would sound like, and such broadcasts always include remarks from the President of the United States. But by copying the techniques of the March of Time to add realism to something that was not real, Welles unintentionally showed the danger of how that show and others blurred the boundaries between journalism and fiction. Many listeners who had believed War of the Worlds to be real news later wrote letters to Welles and the FCC explaining that the most convincing thing about the broadcast was the way it used the names of real institutions and figures of authority. As one anonymous listener wrote to Welles, it was not because of superior acting that the listening audience became hysterical, but because you used government departments and news flashes, which people have always placed faith in prior to your broadcast. Listeners regarded these titles essentially as trademarks, falsely assuming that they could not be invoked without the government's permission. So if an announcer said that the Secretary of the Interior was going to give a special broadcast on the national emergency, even though the guy in charge of our national parks would never address the nation in this kind of crisis, then it had to be true no matter what. Truly, the broadcast seemed incredible, wrote a Maine woman to the FCC, but not as incredible as the thought that our government would allow its name to be used to disseminate such a lie. But of course, the March of Time and other dramatized news shows regularly abused the trust of their audiences in precisely this way. And by exposing this, War of the Worlds ended up challenging the credibility of the entire medium of radio. How will we know when news is news or when it is just fiction, one Mississippian asked the FCC, if that is an example of future radio programs? So the day after War of the Worlds, newspapers around the world reported that Welles's broadcast had thrown the United States into a mass panic. According to the New York Times, a wave of mass hysteria seized thousands of radio listeners throughout the nation during the show, which disrupted households, interrupted religious services, created traffic jams, and clogged communications systems. The fright was most intense in New York and New Jersey, which were the states directly under attack from the Martians. But the Associated Press collected reports of panic from as far afield as Atlanta, Kansas City, and San Francisco. They reported that in Pittsburgh, a man found his wife about to drink poison before the invaders got her, screaming, "I'd rather die this way than like that." In Indianapolis, an unnamed woman interrupted a church service by shouting, "New York destroyed, it's the end of the world. You might as well go home to die. I just heard it on the radio." Fearing that he might face arrest, Welles found himself thrown before reporters in the CBS building that Halloween morning.
In fact, I know they were. That texture was closer.
What do you think, Mr. Wells?
But they have become to consider. I'm of course surprised that the H.G. Wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars, I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips and many succeeding novels and adventure stories should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
One of the questions Welles faced that morning was whether broadcasts like War of the Worlds should be made illegal. At least one United States senator was already making vague statements about passing such a law. It remained unclear if the federal government could or would engage in that kind of outright censorship of the radio. But the question of how to protect Americans from misinformation on the airwaves had suddenly become a vital national issue in the wake of War of the Worlds. And when a reporter asked that question of Welles, he dodged it at the time, saying, "The wisdom of radio executives and of an organized public will decide these things for us. It's not up to me to speak. I'm the accused." And the radio industry took the threat of this kind of legislation or censorship very seriously. The FCC, remember, held the power to take radio stations off the air if they failed to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. And some Americans, particularly people who felt deceived by Welles's broadcast, thought that War of the Worlds represented just such a breach of the public's trust. About a week after War of the Worlds, the chairman of the FCC, Frank McNinch, who's on the left here, met informally with the heads of the major broadcast networks, encouraging them to adopt new program standards to prevent controversial broadcasts in the future. The heads of NBC, CBS, and the Mutual Broadcasting System readily agreed to McNinch's suggestion that news broadcast language, words like bulletin and flash, be kept out of fictional programs. From then on, the journalistic format would be reserved for real news only. These industry leaders were ready and willing to change their own practices to assume the responsibility of regulating themselves, because they knew that if they didn't, the federal government might step in and do it for them. So this was hardly a perfect solution. Commercial broadcasters, determined to avoid another controversy like War of the Worlds, censored themselves far more stringently than I think the FCC ever had any intention of doing. Some radio writers and performers would complain that after 1938, they no longer had the artistic freedom they'd enjoyed earlier in the decade. The major broadcast networks successfully prevented another fake news controversy. Indeed, 30 years would pass before any radio station tried something similar on American airwaves, at least on this scale. But the climate of self-censorship that settled on the industry after War of the Worlds also sapped some of the vitality that had defined radio's golden age. That said, I do think a case can be made that War of the Worlds, by demonstrating the dangerous power of misinformation on the airwaves, served as a positive influence on the development of broadcast news. After War of the Worlds, some of the deceptive practices that had been commonplace on American radio, such as the March of Time style of dramatized news, fell out of favor. Indeed, the March of Time went off the air in 1939 and returned 2 years later with more of a straight news format. At the same time, the small but growing news staffs at the major broadcast networks, especially CBS, took note of War of the Worlds and the threat it represented to their credibility. For instance, in 1941, when radio reported the attack on Pearl Harbor, announcers went out of their way to insist that this was real news, not a hoax, because they knew, as in fact was the case, that some listeners would assume that this was another War of the Worlds type show. And as broadcast journalism grew to meet the challenge of covering World War II, the industry took pains to protect its credibility and avoid the kinds of deception that had been acceptable before 1938. So at least when it came to news, the War of the Worlds broadcast represented an important moment of course correction, but only because the radio industry accepted the responsibility to clean up its own act. And they did so really only because they believed the government might otherwise intervene if they did not fulfill their obligation to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. So even though American law did not change as a result of War of the Worlds, the widespread belief that Orson Welles' broadcast had sparked a nationwide mass panic did significantly change the practices of the radio industry. It also generated a lot of fear among the American public because it raised the question of whether American democracy could survive in the age of electronic media. Americans had watched from afar as Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party consolidated power in Germany, thanks in large part to their use of the mass media. And there was a common belief in the United States that Hitler had used radio and film to hypnotize the German people, essentially to drive the entire country insane, but that Americans wouldn't be susceptible to such a demagogue, that it couldn't happen here. War of the Worlds, however, seemed to shatter that assumption. As one radio listener wrote in a letter to CBS after the broadcast, "I congratulate Mr. Welles on his dramatic ability to sway mobs. Maybe he is to be our Hitler and control us with the sway of his radio voice." These fears were largely based on newspaper accounts of how audiences reacted to War of the Worlds, of the sort that I quoted a few minutes ago. But these early reports were deeply flawed. In large part, the stories were based on vague anecdotal reports of panic, such as the woman in Pittsburgh who almost committed suicide, or the woman who broke up a church service in Indianapolis screaming about the end of the world. And these bulletins were distributed to newspapers over the teletypes, like you see here, by the major press wire services. Taken together, the bulletins seemed to paint a picture of a nation in headlong flight from imaginary aliens. But journalists in 1938 made few attempts to investigate beyond that what had actually happened. And they did almost no follow-up reporting in the days after the show to see how representative these bulletins were. Instead, frantically assembling their front pages in the hours after the show, newspaper staffs simply extrapolated, based on a few isolated extreme examples of fright, a nationwide mass panic that had never actually existed. And were it not for a Gallup poll commissioned 6 weeks later by Princeton University, we would not today have even the faintest idea how many people even heard War of the Worlds, much less how many believed it to be true. That poll was conducted as part of an academic study of the broadcast done by Professor Hadley Cantrell and the Princeton Radio Research Project. Cantrell, like a lot of people, saw War of the Worlds as an opportunity to explore the power of propaganda, to see what made people vulnerable to demagogues like Hitler. And so he never seriously questioned whether the broadcast had truly caused a mass panic. His study, published in 1940 as The Invasion from Mars, deliberately oversampled people frightened by the broadcast, ignored survey data from listeners who knew the show was not real news, and only interviewed people living near the Martian landing site in New Jersey, where all sources agree that the fright was most intense. So these sort of two major sources that we have on the audience response to the broadcast, the first newspaper articles and the invasion from Mars, combined to exaggerate and distort the effect of War of the Worlds. They created an enduring myth, which persists in some sense to this day, that presents the mass media as a hypnotic instrument, able to make people believe in absolutely anything, even something as ridiculous as a Martian invasion. It was only decades later, when people such as myself could access the letters listeners wrote to Wells and the FCC about War of the Worlds, that we could put all this evidence in context and really understand what happened that night. And when you sweep away the myth of the War of the Worlds panic, the reality becomes vitally relevant to our 21st century media environment. We can't know for sure how many listeners misinterpreted Wells's broadcast as real news. The best estimate we have is about 1 million, though that's essentially a guess. But however terrifying the broadcast was, it was rarely enough on its own to send people fleeing into the streets. Some listeners tuned in late, briefly believed until they heard the first reference to Martians and quickly realized the whole thing was fake. Others listened for 10, 15, 20 minutes in a rather agitated state until the station break came and they breathed a great sigh of relief. Very, very few people did anything that could be described as panicking. Later reports of listeners abandoning their homes or taking up arms against the Martians were greatly exaggerated. For example, only 6 listeners who wrote to Wells mentioned having fled their homes because of the broadcast, though at least another 13 were ready to do so. And although the number of angry letters written to the FCC would ultimately be much higher than those written to the Mercury Theater, the number of writers who admitted fleeing in advance of the Martians is almost the same. Even for truly terrified listeners, panic was the exception, not the rule. Still, even though the vast majority of Wells's audience knew the show was fiction or figured it out very quickly, a sizable minority were deceived, and it's important to understand why. The team of researchers Hadley Cantrell assembled to investigate the panic back in 1938 actually found the answer, but the finding was not published in The Invasion from Mars because it wasn't really relevant to the central question of that study. It is simply that most people frightened by War of the Worlds did not understand that the broadcast was about aliens. Just like with Father Knox's broadcasting the barricades back in 1926, people heard what they were most afraid of and interpreted Wells's broadcast in light of those pre-existing fears or beliefs. The Princeton Radio Research Project found that roughly a third of those listeners believed the show to be about a German or a Japanese invasion. A third thought it was some kind of natural disaster, and a third gave it a supernatural explanation, like an alien invasion or the biblical apocalypse. And the letters bear this out. As one Californian wrote to the FCC, "My husband thought it the end of the world, and I thought it was Germany coming over here to destroy us." After a certain point in the show, the references to Mars and Martians grew fewer and fewer, and it became easier and easier to imagine the invaders as something else. People didn't listen attentively to each and every word of the program. They filtered it through their own assumptions and made it fit their own understanding of the world. Listeners with such pre-existing fears or beliefs were not only more likely to believe War of the Worlds was real, they were also more likely to spread the word to other people. In dozens of letters, frightened listeners described phoning up or going to see friends or relatives, telling them to turn on CBS or get out of the path of the invaders. Dozens more letters came from people who tuned in only because they were on the receiving end of those calls, or because their next door neighbor burst in to warn them of the catastrophe in New Jersey. Some of the people who actually did panic or try to flee never heard one word of War of the Worlds, but simply responded to misinformation passed along by someone they trusted. And this created small pockets of hysteria scattered throughout the country. Anywhere a lot of people lived close together, fear easily became contagious, rapidly infecting dozens of other people. And this viral effect is essential to understanding reports of panicked people running in the streets that evening. Listeners ran next door or across the street to warn friends and neighbors or to seek confirmation of what they had heard. But this hysteria had as much to do with the power of rumor as it did with the power of radio. And here is where War of the Worlds, I think, offers its greatest warning to the 21st century. Back in 1938, electronic media could only broadcast. They could only send out a singular message to a very large mass audience. When Orson Welles created a very realistic fake news report about an alien attack on the United States, most of his audience knew that it was fake. But it activated the fears, beliefs, and even prejudices of a sizable minority of that audience. And they, in turn, spread their mistaken beliefs, creating isolated pockets of confusion and panic. This was very much a localized phenomenon, intense where it was felt, but not felt very widely. The vast majority of Americans that night, even those living in New Jersey, saw no panic and had no idea anything unusual was going on. But if you were caught inside it, surrounded by terror, it proved very difficult and often impossible to determine what was true and what was not. So today, in the 21st century, our world is increasingly governed by technologies that accelerate and exacerbate this process. Social media makes it possible not just to broadcast, but to narrowcast, to send specific messages to particular targeted groups. And because people respond most intensely to things that make them fearful or angry, the algorithms that direct traffic on social media push users toward ever more frightening, ever more extreme content. Just like listeners deceived by War of the Worlds, users are more likely to share content that frightens them, that activates their innate fears and prejudices and beliefs. And all too often, people can become lost in a kind of alternate universe created by social media, surrounded by fear and misinformation, unable or unwilling to seek out the truth. And we've seen where that can lead. So on January 6th, 2021, 95 years nearly to the day after the first fake news broadcast in history, Father Knox's vision of a mob attack on free government came true, not in London, but in Washington, D.C. We're still, of course, learning about the causes of the January 6th insurrection, about who's responsible and why. But it's already clear that many of the people who stormed the US Capitol trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election did so because they'd gotten sucked into a world of misinformation and fake news, because they'd fallen for a lie promoted by certain politicians and broadcasters and voices on social media. It's the same basic process that was on display with War of the Worlds, but now it's been perfected by technology and weaponized by the enemies of democracy. So as we look back over nearly a century of radio broadcasting and fake news, there are, I think, a couple lessons that we can take from Father Knox and Orson Welles. There is, of course, a personal responsibility to guard against misinformation and media manipulation. We can and we should teach the basics of media literacy in school so that all Americans are less susceptible to being deceived. But there is an institutional responsibility as well. And I think you see that with War of the Worlds. As radio broadcasting emerged as a very profitable and powerful industry in the 1930s, the networks that became America's primary media platforms in that decade accepted the responsibility to operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. After War of the Worlds, they took steps to address the problems it revealed because they feared the federal government might otherwise interfere with their business. Now we have new digital media platforms that operate with even less regulation, but wield even greater influence in some sense over our national life. And they need to accept the same responsibility to operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. And if they won't, today's FCC needs to impose it for the good of us all. That's really the only way we can hope to avoid getting fooled again. So as long as this talk has been, I've really only scratched the surface of War of the Worlds and the art of fake news. If you want to know more, this is a great place to start here, but I've probably taken up more than enough of your time. I do thank you for your attention. And Daniel, I turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Brad. That was an amazing talk. And I'm sure you're getting a lot of virtual applauses from our virtual audience. Those of you who do not have the book, I would highly recommend it. I have it at my office along with the book about Al Capone. And it's amazing, too, that, Brad, you wrote this. It was published in 2015. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. It came out of my my honors thesis at Michigan was 2012. The book came out in May of 2015.
Yeah, and it's amazing reading it now, just in thinking of, and you ended your talk with that more recent current events. And I think we could really see so clearly the arc of history, from the radio and beyond. So,
I used to, when I would talk about this subject in book talks or whatever, I used to have to make an argument, that people needed to pay attention to this kind of fake news. I don't need to convince people anymore. I think it's very apparent that this is, a very influential force in our politics.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your talk. And those of you who would like to learn more about Brad's book, definitely check that out. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the future at Art Deco Weekend or any other time in Miami Beach. We'd love to see you in person. And thanks again for a really excellent presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you.